Fascism didn't almost come to America on a German U-boat. It came in suits, briefcases, and oddly enough, Wall Street. In 1934, a group of America's wealthiest businessmen, men tied to DuPont, J.P. Morgan, and the Liberty League, secretly approached a Marine Corps general with a simple request: overthrow President Franklin Roosevelt, march 500,000 veterans on Washington, and install a fascist government in the United States. Hold up, give me a minute, because this isn't conspiracy theory. This was sworn testimony before Congress. The fact that you've probably never heard of it speaks to how close the U.S. came to being overthrown by a fascist coup. Now, not surprisingly, this story was quickly buried, but we dug it up. I'm John Genoa. This is America's Strangest History. I think you're gonna like this one. Let's go back to 1934. America wasn't just struggling, it was breaking apart. The Great Depression annihilated the economy. Banks failed by the thousands. Factories shut down. Families lined up for bread, while 12 million people across the nation were unemployed. For veterans, those who'd risked their lives in World War I, life wasn't great. They were still furious over what history calls the bonus army. In 1932, tens of thousands of veterans marched on Washington. They demanded cash bonuses that the government promised them for their service. Instead of making good on those promises, the government met protesters with tanks, tear gas, and bayonets, all under the orders of President Herbert Hoover. During these protests, 2 veterans were killed and thousands were injured. That memory was still raw in 1934. Veterans didn't trust the government, but they did trust one man, a Marine Corps general named Smedley Butler. He was a decorated war hero, beloved by veterans, and most importantly, he had the loyalty of the rank and file. This is where the global stage begins to bleed into America's story. Across the ocean, fascism was on the rise. Mussolini already turned Italy into a police state with his black shirts terrorizing political opponents. Hitler just seized full control of Germany. The world was watching democracy collapse in real time. In the United States, Franklin Delano Roosevelt swept into office with the New Deal. This brought Social Security, jobs, programs, bank reforms, all meant to save the system. Now, for ordinary Americans, it was hope. But for the richest industrialists, it looked like socialism. And so they organized the American Liberty League. It's a coalition of corporate executives and politicians backed by fortunes tied to J.P. Morgan, General Motors, and the DuPont family. They called Roosevelt a traitor to his class. They vowed to spend millions to stop him. Behind the scenes, some of them were willing to go much further than just speeches and pamphlets. If democracy couldn't be stopped at the ballot box, they would try to stop it another way. In the summer of 1933, a man named Gerald McGuire walked into Smedley Butler's life. On paper, McGuire was nothing special, a bond salesman, a mid-level player in Wall Street's orbit, but the way he carried himself, the things he hinted at, it was evident he wasn't acting on his own. He was only the messenger. McGuire claimed he represented powerful men, the kind of men who didn't just run companies, they shaped the direction of the country. He flattered Butler. He talked about his influence with the veterans and about his reputation as the one general the people trusted. And then he dropped his pitch. A movement was forming. 500,000 veterans, organized, disciplined, loyal. All they needed was a leader, a man in uniform, a man like Butler. The plan? March on Washington. Confront Roosevelt. Demand he step aside from the day-to-day running of the country. A new office would be created. A Secretary of General Affairs. Now, this position would hold almost dictatorial powers while President Roosevelt remained as a symbolic figurehead. And who did McGuire's backers want for this role? Isn't it obvious? Smedley Butler. To prove it wasn't idle talk, McGuire opened his briefcase. Inside was cash. Lots of it. $18,000 up front with promises of millions more to follow. Butler pressed him about where the money was really coming from. The answer was chilling. McGuire named one of the backers as Robert Sterling Clark. He's a multi-millionaire banker and heir to the Singer sewing machine fortune. He said Clark was willing to bankroll the movement with up to $30 million. This wasn't just some American fantasy. McGuire bragged that he traveled through Europe studying how fascist regimes mobilized veterans into paramilitary shock troops. He talked about Mussolini's black shirts. He pointed to France's Croix de Feu. It's a movement of ex-soldiers who paraded through Paris with military discipline shaking up the government. That, he said, was the model. It was bold, it was dangerous. The plan boiled down to fascism dressed up in red, white, and blue. Smedley Butler wasn't a fool. He spent his life in smoke-filled rooms with bankers and politicians. He knew when something didn't smell right. So when Gerald McGuire dangled suitcases of cash and spoke casually about overthrowing the President of the United States, Butler didn't laugh. He didn't shout. He didn't even tip his hand. He just leaned back and listened. He asked questions, like, who's behind this? How much money are we really talking about? How would the veterans be organized? And McGuire had all the answers. Answers that sounded rehearsed, like he was reading from a script. Butler played along. He pretended to be interested. He nodded at the right moments, agreed to think it over, but privately, he was building a mental case file. In one of his pitches, McGuire told Butler that the American Legion, the country's largest veterans organization, could be steered towards fascism. He said that speeches were already prepared for Legion conventions. Speeches ghostwritten by Wall Street lawyers. Now, Butler was expected to give one of them. If he stood at that podium and spoke those words, it would give the movement instant legitimacy. But Butler wasn't about to be anyone's puppet. He refused, but he let McGuire think that he was on the hook. The more McGuire talked, the more Butler understood. This wasn't some fringe dream. This was a blueprint for an American dictatorship financed by some of the richest families in the nation. The most chilling part was that the plan wasn't just fantasy. The veterans were real. The money was real. The anger at Roosevelt was real. All they needed was a leader, a general. Butler was aware of the bigger picture. There was a lot at stake, and he knew he had to act carefully. By late 1934, Smedley Butler heard enough. He played along, let the salesmen talk, let the bankers show their hand, but he knew the stakes. If he stayed quiet, the plan might actually move forward. So Butler went to the one place where the truth couldn't be ignored. Congress. Got that? Specifically, the McCormick-Dickstein Committee. It's an early version of what later became HUAC, the House Un-American Activities Committee. Behind closed doors, Butler told his story. He described the meetings, the promises of millions of dollars, the plan to use 500,000 veterans as shock troops. He even gave names: Gerald McGuire, Robert Sterling Clark, and connections reaching into the American Liberty League, the political arm of America's richest corporations. Butler's testimony was explosive. He wasn't some wild-eyed radical. He was a retired Marine General, twice decorated with the Medal of Honor. He was beloved by the American people. If Butler said the plot was real, people listened. Journalists were brought in to corroborate. Paul Comley French, a reporter Butler trusted, confirmed that he too had been approached and shown evidence of the plan. Now, this wasn't just Butler's word. So there was a pattern, there were receipts. The committee investigated. Here's the part most Americans never learn. They admitted Butler was telling the truth. Their final report plainly states that there was evidence of an attempted coup. But when the report was released to the public, the names of the wealthy backers were gone. The report was sanitized, buried, edited out of history. Instead of trials, newspapers ran stories mocking Butler. They called him gullible and suggested he exaggerated. The New York Times dismissed the whole affair as a cocktail pooch, like it was a silly rumor whispered over martinis. But it wasn't a rumor. A decorated general testified under oath that Wall Street bankers tried to install fascism in America, and the government's own investigators agreed. Now you'd think once Congress confirmed an attempted coup, America would erupt in outrage. Arrests would be made. Headlines would scream the names of the responsible parties. But that never happened. When the McCormick-Dickstein Committee released its final report, it admitted there was evidence of a plot. But the names, the powerful men implicated, the corporations allegedly tied to the scheme, gone, scrubbed clean. And the men suspected of bankrolling the plan, they went right back to their boardrooms. No indictments, no trials, no public shaming, nada. What do you think of that? A decorated Marine general testifies under oath that America's richest families tried to overthrow the government, and instead of jail cells, nothing. Got that? Things went south for Butler. He became a pariah in elite circles. The same press that once praised him as the fighting Quaker now painted him as a crank. But veterans still believed him, and history, when you look closely, vindicates him. Because the evidence matches the pattern. The money, the organizations, the rhetoric, all of it lines up with what fascist movements were doing in Europe at that exact moment. The only reason it failed here was because the guy they wanted for the job, the guy they wanted to lead, said no. Nearly a century later, America never got closure. The plotters escaped punishment. The evidence was buried. In the years that followed, the plot faded from headlines and out of America's memory. The American Liberty League continued throwing money at anti-Roosevelt campaigns, but by the late 1930s, it was collapsing under its own weight. Most Americans wrote it off as a paranoid rumor. Butler, however, didn't stay quiet. He went on the road and he gave fiery speeches about war profiteering, corporate corruption, and the danger of fascism at home. In 1935, he published his famous book, War is a Racket. In it, he said that for most of his career, he hadn't been fighting for freedom. He'd been, in his own words, a gangster for capitalism. He warned that fascism wasn't some foreign import. It wasn't something that only happened in Berlin or Rome. It could happen anywhere at all. Elites feared that they're losing their power, even here in America. Then, almost as quickly as he stepped into the spotlight, Butler was gone. He died in 1940, just a year before the United States entered World War II. Ironically, the war against the very fascism he warned about. Today, most Americans never heard of the business plot. It's a footnote in history. But think about what it means. In 1934, fascism didn't almost come to America on a U-boat. It came through men in suits, sitting in boardrooms, willing to bankroll a dictator if it meant protecting their fortunes. But for the general who refused to betray democracy, the United States might have taken a very different path. What do you think of that? I'm John Genoa. You've been watching America's Strangest History. Thanks for watching.